Today is a open session without much presenting at all on a roadmap to restoring AFRINIC. Now we put this was almost the first topic on the agenda for this event way back in November last year, because at that point we were pretty sure we would need some sort of strategy for rescuing AFRINIC. There was lots of discussion. Exactly what content would go into this presentation was pretty much in flux until, well, earlier this week when we got some announcements from AFRINIC. So I'm not going to do much talking here at all. I am going to start by giving you an extremely detailed history of AFRINIC and how we got into the current situation. And that's it. In 2004, AFRINIC was formed. The years in between, corruption, IP address theft, lots and lots of litigation, dozens and dozens of cases, the details of which are largely not that relevant for the current purpose. And here we are now, 2025, in a mess where AFRINIC has no board, and on the 23rd of June, we now have an announced date of the election of a new AFRINIC board. That is for all 8 seats of the board. AFRINIC will hopefully, after the end of June, have a board again. It can then hire a CEO and get back to doing business. Now, we did invite someone from AFRINIC to come and present at today's session. They very politely declined. I believe that the receiver is being quite cautious in what public engagements AFRINIC can do, so I do understand that they wanted to decline the invite. And they are listening in, I hope, on the presentation. And they did ask that we read out the communique that was issued earlier this week. It's 3 pages long, and I didn't think it's really worth out reading word for word, but you can go and get it on that URL if you want the details. I do have a few slides here just to summarize what that says. So first up, the first 3/4 of a page is spent repeating the receiver's mandate from the court, which essentially boils down to 2 things. To reconstitute the board by way of an election, 3 things. To keep AFRINIC going in some fashion until there is a new board, and the mandate that the receiver has is to make sure that thereafter a CEO is appointed. That's important. The receiver's duties do not stop with the board. They also have to make sure that there is a CEO. The election date has been set as the 23rd of June 2025. That is the 3rd date and the 3rd extension that the court has condoned. But apparently the court has signed off on that due date, so it is now set for sure. What else does the communique say? It says that a nominations committee has been formed. The nominations committee has been formed not in accordance with AFRINIC's bylaws, but in a completely made-up process because it is not possible for AFRINIC to hold elections that are entirely consistent with its bylaws because it currently has no board. Instead, a nominations committee has been set up that consists, it would seem, entirely of UK-based barristers. There is a King's Counsel with 3 other barristers supporting him, and that nominations committee has been tasked with the detail work, setting out the timelines between now and the 23rd of June, and setting out what the election process. The nominations committee is also going to set eligibility requirements and issue a call for candidates, noting that there will have to be some variation from the normal requirements for AFRINIC board members. For example, you would usually have to have been to at least 2 AFRINIC recent meetings in order to stand as an AFRINIC board member. You can't do that because there have not been AFRINIC board meetings while it's been under receivership. The nominations committee, if appropriate, interviews the candidates. They will provide a final list of candidates, and it's their job to supervise the conduct of the polls by the electoral committee and an organization known as Civica. What are those 2? The elections committee, also something that AFRINIC's bylaws mandate, has the job of actually conducting the election. They handle the pre-election process to make sure they know who's going to vote, and they conduct the polls on the day. That has been constituted largely of, well, it's chaired by an AFRINIC staff member, the head of value-added service, that's Yogesh Chadi, supported by another AFRINIC staff member, a member of staff from Civica, which we'll see at the bottom of that slide, and an accountant from the receiver's office. Their job is to do the nuts and bolts of the election process. Actually handling the election themselves is a commercial operation, also based in the UK, called Civica Election Services. They have been appointed to operate the electronic voting platform That tells us there will be electronic voting, because otherwise they wouldn't be being paid to operate the electronic voting platform, and to provide the physical ballot papers for in-person voting when that takes place. So that's a summary of what the AFRINIC communique said. The intention for this slot is to open the floor for a discussion of what AFRINIC strategy options there are. How do we get from the mess we are now in today, after years of litigation, to a AFRINIC that is functional? Now, the obvious strategy right now, because we have an election coming up, we have a date, we should soon know what the process is going to be for nominees, is to simply support that election process. And if that's what consensus is the best thing to do, we need to make sure we have quality candidates that are nominated, and we need to make sure that suitable quality candidates get votes. Good to have some discussion about that. Other alternatives. There could be a decision by individuals, by many stakeholders, by groups of vested interests, that what we really need here is more litigation. Going back to that slide. I'm not convinced that more litigation is really what we need here, since that's largely what's got us into this mess in the first place. But there are certainly a number of parties that are currently suffering under the AFRINIC's non-functionality. There are networks who have requested, and in some cases paid for numbering resources, and have not got them in violation of AFRINIC's commitment to how fast they will process things. That is problematic. If you're one of these networks, it is hurting you right now. There are networks who've tried to become AFRINIC members over the last year or so and been denied, because AFRINIC is not currently allowing new entities to join in the absence of a board. And it could be argued that there is grounds to litigate a problematic election process. If you're unhappy that the nominations committee was not drawn from individuals located in Africa, and instead has a bunch of foreigners looking at the nominations process and the election being run by a bunch of people from outside of Africa, you might think that's a problem. It's not in line with the bylaws. This could be something that needs to be challenged. So I'd be interested to hear from those affected. Is there any use at all in trying to litigate any of these things before the election happens, or is our best bet to let the election run its course and then see if everything gets back on track with the resources being allocated? I've also seen ideas floated that we should go about setting up a competing regional registry, and some even more outlandish ideas have been tossed around. I'm going to open the floor for some discussion of those points in a moment, but let's assume we stick with the obvious strategy. We're going to support the election process. Well, if that's what we think is the best thing to do, then the question becomes, who do we want as our AFRINIC board candidates? And more importantly, what do we actually want those candidates to do when they get elected? Because if I have a vote, I actually want to know from the candidates on the 24th of June, once you're elected, what are you going to do? What are your first priorities as a potential board member for AFRINIC? Certainly, I would like to see that the backlog of resource allocations that aren't being processed must be the number one task that the board has. Make sure it unsticks that, and those who've paid or requested resources, if it's appropriate, they need to get those resources. And new member applications, networks that can't get off the ground because they can't join, so they cannot get IPv4 resources they need, they should be allowed to become AFRINIC members. But there may be other things we want to say the board needs to do. We want to be clear with our candidates, what is it we expect you to do if we vote for you once you get onto the board? We might decide that we want to take a position on ICP2. Those of you who followed policy discussions, AFRINIC was established under the current ICP2, which is the guidelines for recognizing regional internet registries. Those guidelines were written before LACNIC and AFRINIC existed, and it was on the basis of those guidelines that those two regional internet registries were recognized. There has been extensive redrafting of that document into something that's now called a governance document for the recognition, maintenance, and de-recognition of regional internet registries. It may be that we think this is a good document, and we want to have AFRINIC board members that are going to commit to committing AFRINIC to that document once it's in place, because if AFRINIC became non-functional again, that would create grounds for it to be taken away and given to a new registry. There isn't currently really a policy process in place for dealing with a failed regional registry as we've seen in AFRINIC for the last 2 to 3 years. So that's it, just some background context, and now opening the floor for discussion. What are everyone's views on how we should, as the ZANOC community, AFRINIC resource holders in South Africa and elsewhere, what is our strategy for dealing with the upcoming election and AFRINIC more broadly? Anyone feel that we should be doing something other than just supporting the election process?
Hendrik Versage, Visco Systems and Visage Cloud Solutions. I'm one of those that wants to swing the bat. Yes, I have paid for resources. Yes, I'm still waiting for them, and it is hurting my business. So, based on the report, well, by the announcement that came out, yes, support the election process. Yes, get the right people on board. Start now to get the right people on board. But then also another question would be, what if some of the other adversaries that don't like the board that came on board continues with litigation and stuff? How are we going to handle that? So Sun Tzu said, prepare for war in times of peace. And that's sort of what I'm asking, I think ISPA needs to, and you here need to ask the question or answer the question, whether we should not start preparing for the litigation in case it that we do require it to go into litigation phase. So yes, support the election as best as we can, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Wise words. It's quite challenging to prepare for litigation if you don't know what you're going to be litigating. So, I mean, that's a good point. We could see an election taking place, good candidates getting voted in, candidates that we think would do a good job, and then somebody else decides they want to litigate because they'd prefer to keep AFRINIC in limbo indefinitely. At that point, yes, it will probably be necessary to look at all the options. Can we go to court to force AFRINIC to continue issuing resources while the rest of the litigation pans out? Or is it time to start looking at the process for de-recognizing an RIR? Cool.
Okay, you mentioned we're aware of this, that there's applications that have not been processed. And there's a lot of information we're not seeing. Do we have any idea of the number or size of those applications that are sitting paid for that have not been processed? Is there information available on that? And if we go through the process of this election process, and the questionability of the ability of the nominated board to process, what would be a reasonable time frame to judge their performance on actually processing these outstanding applications before we turn around and say, well, we've actually appointed a useless board here and we need to litigate or start another process somehow? Do you have any idea of that number and the thumbsuck of the time that we should be allowing?
A little. I gather.
And I can answer the question about the number.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Donald Jolly. Paul, to answer your question, we are aware of 10 applications for /22s at the moment.
Only, yeah?
Well, that we are aware of as a certain group. I'm sure there are many other in Africa, but I think that's just from South Africa and a couple in Kenya.
So I just want to acknowledge at this point the AFRINIC staff. The AFRINIC staff have been doing a good job under very trying circumstances over the last couple of years. And the strong impression I have is that once the receiver is no longer needed because there is a board and a CEO, it may be a matter of them simply getting out of the way of the AFRINIC staff and letting the staff just get on with doing their jobs. Because they're being prevented from doing what they would normally do in allocating those by concerns that there's no board in place, so that AFRINIC shouldn't be doing decisions. But we're also not getting terribly clear communications from AFRINIC. When the current receiver replaced the previous one in February, a bunch of stuck applications were suddenly processed, and then they stopped again. So we saw from November last year through to February, some of those were suddenly processed. It wasn't clear whether those were applications where someone had paid their lawyers to agitate and write threatening letters, or if they were simply a matter of they were told, okay, you can process this batch, but not those because they came in after a certain date. It's really not clear what the bases were for which ones were handled. It may be that some of those 10 are not going to get resources because AFRINIC might come back to them and say, no, you don't meet the criteria, so please give us more information, we have to reassess it again. That's possible. Because the communication's been poor, it's a little hard to know. In terms of time, if the board's been in a month and that process hasn't unstuck, that would be, for me, problematic. It shouldn't take that long at all. We're looking days, maybe weeks, for AFRINIC's processes to get back on board once there's a sitting board, I would think. But no, someone else might have a different measure.
Okay. Final question. There's been some, well, not exactly rumours, but it was floated against the Constitution that the voting process was not going to be available online and would all have to go off to Mauritius. Yeah, lots of holidays in Mauritius, but carrying proxies of 5. There are also certain individuals and people contacting certainly my members, fishing for proxies and doing all sorts of things, and spreading the notion that online voting would not be allowed. I would like you to confirm that in this process, online voting is allowed from South Africa.
I can't confirm that. I'm not running the election. But I think we have very, very strong indications from the communications from AFRINIC so far that that is going to be the case. The specific mandate they've given to Civica, who they're paying to run their elections, is that they're to do 2 things. They are to run the online electronic voting, and they are to print the ballots for in-person voting. And those 2 things wouldn't be spelled out in the communique from AFRINIC if they weren't planning on allowing online voting. Since from the communications, I'm personally confident that there will be electronic voting. The issue of organizations going and trying to get power of attorney from entities, the issue of gathering lots of proxies and getting up against the 5 limit that AFRINIC has when it's difficult for people to travel, I think those fall away. Since I think we can assume there'll be electronic voting, there's no need for anyone to give their power of attorney to anybody else. The rumors that you have to be there in person fall away, and we should be encouraging everybody to participate directly and have their own vote and not delegate to anybody else the job of voting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, and Donald Jolly again for those that are watching on the live stream. Just to confirm that those 10 applications have already been approved and paid for.
Okay.
So I have a question from somebody that's watching remotely. They've asked, does ISPA have current candidates, and how do we know who in the other regions to vote for?
Not agreed candidates yet, and I'm not sure yet. Depends on what the nominations process is going to be. Remember, the announcement on the 21st establishes a nominations committee and says it's their job to announce the process by which we get to the elections, including who can be nominated. It's difficult to know for sure who we can nominate if, for example, we don't know whether the obligation to have been at 2 recent AFRINIC meetings falls away. If there's no obligation to have been to past AFRINIC meetings, then the potential candidates we could put forward changes a lot. If we're limited to people who've been to recent AFRINIC meetings, that definitely reduces the potential candidates we could put forward. So until we've got some clarity on that, it's a little hard to know who the candidates would be. We will most certainly work closely with other ISPA organizations. We've already chatted to a few of them. Some of them participated in our crisis briefing meeting we held for the banks and the universities and other legacy resource holders a week or so ago. We will coordinate with other ISP organizations, make sure we have an understanding what they think of the candidates, and most likely communicate a some indication of which candidates we think will be good for the ISP community. But we don't yet have a slate of candidates because we don't know who can be nominated.
Thank you. There are no other questions behind me, so I'm going to ask the next one. I'm not sure if you can answer this one because it's, I see he's just edited the question. How do we get the CEO appointed, and specifically how are the qualifications requirements for this person set?
That's something that AFRINIC's bylaws specifically make a function of the board. The board appoints the CEO. So the new board will need to have the ability and the qualifications to identify and recognize the right attributes in that person.
All right. No other people behind me. What happens with anyone that has already signed a POA and now wants to revoke that? I'm not sure if you can answer that one.
Well, that's a good question for lawyers. What happened? How do you revoke a power of attorney if you've given it?
Go and see another lawyer.
So for those that are on the live stream, it's go see another lawyer.
Look, if you've given power of attorney to someone else, but you are the representative with AFRINIC, and when the time comes for the election process to be clarified, and you're the one that gets the credentials to participate in the voting, even if you've previously signed a power of attorney, then it's going to be you voting. So I would encourage anyone that's done that to pay very careful attention. If you have signed away power of attorney, how will I be able to vote? Can I exercise my ability to vote directly, even if I have signed a power of attorney? And Dom's advice is probably quite good. If you're very worried about it, speak to a lawyer about getting out of your power of attorney.
That's it from me. But I just want to say thank you for actually rounding off that. It's very important for all AFRINIC members to go out there and vote.
And please, if you're a member and you think you represent a member body, but you don't know who has control or your login or who your representative is, sort that out now. The AFRINIC team are really good about helping members go through the process of accessing the MyAFRINIC portal and all of those things. Don't wait until the day before the election to make sure you've got your control of your own election credentials. Do it now. Make sure you understand who in your organization has access to the AFRINIC systems, so that when the election comes up, it should be fairly painless for you to participate.
Hi, and thanks. Nishal Govardhan. Thank you for actually saying it very well. I just wanted to remind people that were thinking about voting that this might sound weird, but you actually need to have your account in good standing so you can vote. And generally, and I know this from experience, generally people don't have their accounts in good standing, and when you try to get it done at the last minute, it is a mission for the AFRINIC staff to validate that this has come in. It has not gotten easier with the banking there over the years, so even though it sounds like AFRINIC is trying to extort money from you, it isn't. It's simply you paying your membership fee for the year, right? So sort out your membership fees well in advance of the voting date, which is the 23rd, and allow the AFRINIC team sufficient time to validate and verify. And you should absolutely check for yourself, at least a week before, to make sure that your account is in good standing. There is a little green tick box on the MyAFRINIC portal. Because if it isn't, they do this process manually, and it takes time. I've been caught out by this as well, so consider that a warning. Thanks, Hans.
Yeah, I've also had the question, well, if AFRINIC's dysfunctional, should I just stop paying them for a while? How might that affect my resources? I would definitely not advise that. You don't want to find that a new board comes in, it might not be the board we want, and they have a look at this and say, well, we're just going to decide now that anybody who hasn't paid for their resources loses them, or some other outrageous decision. Don't put yourself in a situation where you could, under any pretext, lose your resources. Please keep paying your AFRINIC bill, make sure you are in good standing, and do the admin homework to make sure you understand who your AFRINIC representative is when it comes to vote. Any more questions? Anyone want to make any other suggestions for an overall strategy? It seems that there's a reasonable comfort in following the election process. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew Owens. I know there's been a lot of chatter about this in the local community. There's only so much that we can do here Is there any indication, does anybody have any sort of idea of what's happening in the rest of the continent? I mean, are there similar efforts, similar discussions, anything that anybody knows about?
There are certainly discussions in East Africa. Our East African colleagues are having similar meetings and similar discussions. A little bit Anglophone West Africa. I'm not 100% sure about North and Central. I think it's unlikely that ISPs in those areas aren't having some sorts of discussions.
Hi, Donald Jolly again. Just to answer that question, both in Nigeria and Tanzania, and as you said, Kenya as well. I'm not sure if you...
No.
Something different, okay.
Hi, Nishal, you can blame me, but the question is on behalf of an anonymous coward. The receiver got the court to approve an extension. Can ISPA please request a copy of the court order from the receiver? The request is from an ISPA member, I've just checked, so I think they're asking you to do this and they don't want to identify themselves, so could ISPA do that?
Is there any reason we need that?
I have no idea. I'm still waiting.
I mean, it's an annoying factor of the Mauritian courts that it's quite a pain to get copies of court proceedings. They're not public, so you have to go through a bit of an effort to get them. Is the concern that this is fake news somehow and that date might not be valid, or? Not sure.
Nothing's being typed. I think it probably is. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing for transparency. If maybe we could just find out who got that extension. But that's all I have.
We haven't given our Mauritian lawyers specific instructions to get proof that the communique issued was accurate. I guess we could do that. Any other thoughts, comments at all on overall suggestion? If not, then I'm just going to assume that everybody here is going to make absolutely sure that they vote if they're a resource holder, and that you're going to do some homework and go and check that you are able to vote when that elections come up in June. Okay, then I think let's close there. Thank you very much.